pleasure today to introduce Dr. Joseph Charney. We have called Jay. And so this is a little bit change of pace in terms of seminar here. I've been actually working with Jay for several years on a project because, believe it or not, we do get fires here, even on Long Island. We get the famous Sunrise Fire, I think it was 95 or so, and then April of 2012, Ridge Manor Fire was pretty amazing and stuff. So just give a little bit of background on Jay. He got his Bachelor of Science in Physics at Penn State, went to Maryland, got a Master's in Meteorology, and then went back to Penn State for a PhD in Meteorology. And then I think you're visiting scientist at North Carolina State for a while, right?
Correct, yeah.
The visiting scientist or professor there at North Carolina State for a couple of years, and then I think you've been at the Northern Research Station for the Forest Service for the last 12, 13 years or so. And he's a research meteorologist there and so forth. And he's kind of leading the charge there in terms of their efforts of numerical weather prediction, ensembles, and boundary layer issues as applied to these fire weather situations. So with that, let's welcome Jay.
Alrighty. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Brian and I have been working together for going on 6 years now, and he's been out to visit me once or twice, and I was been eager to come out here ever since we started, so I really appreciate the opportunity. A little bit more background about me, if you will, just to get this started. I am, as Brian indicated, a research meteorologist in the Northern Research Station in the Forest Service. The Forest Service employs nationwide, depending on how you count and what sort of titles we include, between 9 and 11 atmospheric scientists. And these atmospheric scientists are responsible, if you will, for studying both the atmospheric impacts on fire, the meteorological connection between fire-atmosphere interactions, as well as smoke dispersion and all that goes with that. So we've got kind of a very broad mandate or a broad area that we look into. And some of us have different foci, some of us look in other places. I want to push back slightly against the idea that I'm leading the efforts at East Lansing. I am part of a team at East Lansing. We have two other researchers there, if you will. And Warren Heilman is more of the team leader, although what Brian said is I'm sort of spearheading the effort for the mesoscale modeling and ensemble effort, and that is definitely accurate. But as far as TBL and turbulence and all that other fun stuff, I'm more of the team player and how all that works. So what I want to do, the title of my talk focuses on the mixed layer, but I think what we'll find is that probably about half the time here I'm going to be talking more generally about fire things and fire problems. Because one of the things that I found, I mean, I came to this position 13 years ago not knowing the first thing about fire weather. I was a mesoscale modeler, atmospheric scientist. I had worked on fronts, and I had worked on hurricanes, and I worked on severe storms and flood prediction systems and all kinds of different areas over the years through school and my postdoc years. And I came here and I said, okay, how does this fire thing work? And it's taken me in the last 13 years, I've learned quite a lot about how the fire thing works and quite a lot about how it doesn't work as well. And so one of the things that I want to focus on here is sort of, I don't want to call it a disconnect because that's a bit strong, but certainly the difference in expectations about what the fire community, and specifically the fire management community, would really like to know about how the atmosphere affects fires, and what we really understand and what we really feel we can deliver about how an atmosphere affects fires and vice versa. So that's going to kind of be a thread that's running through a lot of my discussion here, or a lot of the points I'm going to make. But what I hope will tie it all together is this focus or this reference to the mixed layer. All right. Now, as most of you undoubtedly know, I mean, the surface-based mixed layer is the part of the atmosphere that, by definition, interacts with the fire. If you talk about other aspects of meteorological processes, talk about storms or precipitation or fronts, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on aloft that matters, and all of those interactions happen sort of in situ. The fire is at the ground, So if whatever's happening in the loft doesn't affect a change in conditions at the ground, then the fire is not going to respond to it. Now, if you're going to ask what happens with the stuff that comes out of the fire, like the smoke, sure, you have to know what's going on aloft. But as far as what actually affects the evolution of a fire, it has to happen right at the ground, or very near the ground. All right? So the evolution of a fire is affected by the meteorological conditions within the mixed layer. And the time scales that we're talking about here in spatial scales are really, really broad. Combustion happens on time scales on the order of seconds and centimeter scale. The models that come closest to resolving the processes of importance for combustion operate on centimeter scales, whereas the finest models that we can run, I mean, arguably we can get down to a meter or a half meter scale, and we can have some belief that we're reproducing reality, but it varies from location to location. And also the time scales that are important for how a fire is going to evolve vary on time scales of minutes to days. Sometimes what's going on minute by minute matters. Sometimes what's going on day by day matters. And these sorts of variations, or this sorts of variability, is intrinsic to the way that the mixed layer works, the sort of turbulent interactions that happen in the mixed layer. So what I'm planning to address here, the presentation will discuss the role of the mixed layer in the evolution of a fire and in the dispersion of smoke. And I've got several different topics here, depending on how the time goes. We might not get to all of them, but we're certainly going to delve into some of these issues. And I want to try as much as possible to focus in on the meteorological processes that are associated with these phenomena. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but there's a lot of statistical analysis that goes into sort of the development of tools that fire people use, that the fire management community uses to try to understand what's going to happen in a fire. And while that's all well and good, and the data is out there to suggest that there are these connections, understanding the physics behind those connections is often much more complicated than trying to establish a statistical connection. So, a little bit of context, and there's kind of a point to going through this that we'll touch on later on. The atmospheric boundary layer, or also called the planetary boundary layer, or just the boundary layer, is of course the bottom layer of the troposphere that's in direct contact with the surface of the Earth. And the definitions and structures and ways in which we identify it, most of them go back to Stoll's work in 1988, the introduction to boundary layer meteorology. All right. Now, the atmospheric boundary layer is often, not always, but it's often turbulent. So there's all kinds of complex multi-scale interactions going on. And generally speaking, the definition of the boundary layer is that it is capped, that there's a statically stable layer of air or temperature inversion that's at the top of the boundary layer. Now, it's not, I would argue that there's not always one of those, and that you can define boundary layers without them, but the formal definition is that you have to have this cap to define the top of the boundary layer. If you don't have a cap, then how exactly you define it becomes a little bit muddy, I would say. Now, during fair weather over land, the atmospheric boundary layer has a marked diurnal cycle. Okay, it rises as the ground heats up, or it gets deeper as the ground heats up, and it sinks at night, and it collapses when the sun goes down, or when there's no longer heating. And this diurnal cycle is important for fires. It's very important for fires, and we'll talk about that some more later. Now, during the daytime, the mixed layer, a mixed layer of vigorous turbulence develops. Now, the mixed layer is what I specifically want to focus on. I think one can argue that what's going on several thousand meters above the ground, or a thousand more meters above the ground, as far as this inversion layer, it's hard to argue that that always has an effect on a fire. It can potentially, but it's hard to argue that it always does. All right? So, AMS Glossary of Meteorology also provides a definition for the mixed layer, which is related to the atmospheric boundary layer. It is this turbulent layer of a certain thickness, and it's defined as below the location of the Kappan inversion, where you have statically stable air above. All right? And again, we go into a little more detail. The top of the mixed layer is often associated with sharp changes in atmospheric conditions. Potential temperature starts to increase with height rather than being comparatively very similar throughout a well-mixed layer. Sharp decrease in water vapor. All of these other factors tend to change pretty dramatically at the top of the mixed layer, or sharply at the top of the mixed layer. All right, and the mixed layer, much like the boundary layer, can be quite variable in space and time. Typically, during fair weather daytime conditions, which are when most fires happen, the mixed layer depth tends to increase over the course of the day. And shortly after sunrise, it can be as shallow as tens of meters. It can be reach up and touch the top of the mixed layer and virtually. But in the afternoon, depending on where you are, how warm it is, and what sort of conditions you have near the ground, it can be as deep as 1 to 4 kilometers before sunset. So with that as sort of the background, that's sort of setting the context for the mixed layer that I'm specifically referring to here. Here I want to talk a little bit in general about how fire and smoke are thought of, I guess, and the sorts of processes and the sorts of meteorological conditions that affect it. All right, and here I want to sort of think about the span of scales, both spatial and temporal, that are important or that affect or that have the potential to affect the evolution of a fire. And virtually all of these scales are important to the people who are out there trying to fight them. And that's where there is a very real challenge to this. So, I mean, firefighters, they're standing on the fire line in some of these places. They're trying to protect buildings. They're trying to protect sensitive areas. They're trying to make fuel breaks. They're trying to just control the fire that's directly in front of them, on this tree, trying to keep it from getting to that tree. And the processes that affect how difficult that is are, to our way of thinking, almost inherently microscale, changing second by second, minute by minute. And sometimes these sorts of interactions can lead to some very dramatic looking, and this is a picture of a fire world that happened in, a picture of a fire world that happened in California around one of these fires. Now sometimes these fire worlds are just transient phenomena that happen for a second and then they go away. Sometimes there have been situations, there was a report of a fire that happened in Washington at one point where they told all the people, because a big fire was coming into town, to park all of their vehicles in the middle of a dry lake bed because it would be safe there from the fire. But one of these things spun off from the fire and it melted windows in the cars a mile away from the fire front where there was nothing but dirt between them and the fire. So sometimes these things can transport considerable amounts of energy away from the fire and cause real problems, but more often than not they're sort of transient features. But the thing is, if you're standing right there, that's pretty important to you, regardless of where you are. But if you know to be further back, it's less of a problem. But either way, it's very much inherently microscale, sort of the tree-to-tree spread of a fire. All right. Now, there are also what I would identify as more like mesogamma scale structures on the order of hundreds of meters that are hypothesized to be important for the evolution of a fire. Now, I say hypothesized, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, because it's hard to validate some of these ideas. We observe them, we see the sorts of airflow, this is a sort of looking down on top of a fire, the sorts of flow that happens around a fire, and this is sort of a 3D view. There's signs of like descending rear inflow in fires and the sorts of vortices. It looks very similar in many ways to a mid-latitude convective storm and the way that they would evolve. Many similar features occur around the fires, around a fire zone on this scale of hundreds of meters that we hypothesize have some effect on how the fire evolves, how the fire moves across the landscape. But again, it's hard to validate these sorts of things, particularly with observations. And then if you go even to a larger scale, I would argue on the order of kilometers or two, there's evidence that some of these fires produce structures that are even more similar, I would say, to what a mesoscale convective system looks like, where you get sort of these mesoscale large circulations around a fire. And there's evidence or suggestion that when you get these sorts of interactions developing, that the fires can be even more dangerous, and that's how a large fire can become a mega fire, for instance, or a moderate-sized fire can become a very large fire. With these sorts of interactions happen. But again, being able to predict these and understand what exactly is going on is still a work in progress. And then the synoptic conditions can affect the final shape of a fire. If you have different wind directions on different days, this is from the Pagami Creek wildfire in Minnesota in 2011. This was a fire that actually burned, and we're only looking at 11 days. This fire burned over the course of, it kept burning for multiple months. But for the most part, these were the big spread days. But if you look at it, September 5th, it just spread a little bit. September 13th, you have sort of this shape out here. September 12th, there was a massive, a very strong low-level jet that came into the area, and it spread the fire over this entire area. The 11th, it was spreading to the south. The 12th, it spread to the east. All right? So the synoptic, and it's not just wind shifts also. It's also changes in other conditions that matter as well on the sort of synoptic timescale. So day-to-day variations can have a very direct impact on what a fire looks like as it evolves and the sorts of problems that the fire managers are facing. So So as I've been trying to suggest, predicting fire behavior, so what specifically is going on the fire line, and ultimately how big a fire is going to get, is very complex. So spatially and temporally, many different scales involved. All right, and the different types of individuals from different agencies on an individual fire who are trying to provide the best intelligence, best information, the best forecast to the people. There's also different types of people that do that. All right. So the first one that I want to highlight is actually an individual that, in my experience, most meteorologists have never even heard of. It's a person called a fire behavior analyst, and the fire behavior analyst is responsible for one of their responsibilities is looking at the weather data and trying to determine what sort of fire behavior is likely to happen on a fire. And by fire behavior, we mean things like how fast it's going to spread and how tall are the flames going to be, what's the likelihood that it's going to change from a ground fire, get up into a canopy, and become a crown fire that's a much bigger problem, how much lofting of fire branches are going to be, what's going to be the character of the spread. And one of the things that is thrown around often in fire behavior research and fire behavior terminology is sort of the fire triangle. There are three elements that have a strong effect or that are important for fire behavior. There's the topography, there's the fuel, and then there's the weather. Well, topography doesn't change. It changes on geographic timescale. So generally speaking, you know what's going on with the topography. The fuel conditions also tend to change relatively slowly. It's relatively rare for fuels to suddenly become extremely dry. That happens over the course of several days or weeks. Weather changes, as we've already established, on a second-by-second or minute-by-minute or hour-by-hour basis. And so the fire behavior analyst is one of the people that's sort of the liaison between the weather information and the fire management community. And they have their own models, not necessarily developed by meteorologists, that have some what meteorologists would consider bizarre assumptions that go into them. But at the same time, these models are able to give a prediction of how a fire is likely to spread over the landscape over the course of the next few hours or even the next few days. And the fire behavior analysts take the weather information, input them into these models, and then move that information onto the fire managers. Now, for the very big fires, particularly the big western fires, incident meteorologists from the National Weather Service, they provide sort of direct fire line access to the meteorological models, data, what I refer to here as detailed meteorological information. They set up satellite uplinks, and sometimes they run their own models. They'll run time-scale models, but generally speaking, they're the liaison between the guys on the ground who are going out there getting singed and breathing smoke, and the information that you can get back from the weather service or from other locations to try to understand what's going to happen. So if you've got questions about is there going to be a low-level jet, or is there going to be some unusual phenomenon today, the IMETs are usually the first ones that are going to highlight what might be happening there. Now, the other sources of information, the other sorts of people, you get spot weather forecasts that you can request, that they often request from the local weather forecast office. And you also get fire danger predictions that are prepared daily from surface weather observations. And the remote automated weather stations are the station of choice for producing these fire danger predictions. Some of you may or may not have heard of the National Fire Danger Rating System. That's computed from these RAWS stations. And oftentimes these RAWS stations they can be kilometers or tens of kilometers away from the fire location. And sometimes they're even on the other side of a hill, which provides a particular special flavor of problem if you're trying to say that the meteorological conditions on the east side of the Cascades are representative of what's happening on the west side of the Cascades. Maybe not, but they use it. They do it that way. So these are some of the challenges, I guess, that we face as meteorologists in trying to tease some of these issues out. All right, and then looking to sort of longer time scales, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but there are organizations that try to assess what sort of fire conditions and what sort of weather conditions might affect a fire on timescales on the order of 1 to 3 weeks. Then they have seasonal outlooks to try to prepare staffing and say, is it going to be an El Nino year, or what might that mean, what's that meant in the past for fires, and those sorts of questions. So different individuals are involved with all of that. And then, stepping back from fire for a second and thinking about smoke, the way that smoke evolves, the way that smoke concentrations increase or decrease around a fire is also very much a concern for firefighter safety, as well as for if you're lighting a fire, doing an intentional prescribed burn for resource management or for fuel management. You don't want to light a prescribed burn if 5 miles down the road there's a hospital and you're going to smoke out the hospital. So you have certain windows, certain conditions that you want to that need to be certain weather conditions, wind directions, and other conditions that need to be in place for establishing when you can burn. And then, even then, you can get differences between situations where you're lighting a fire and the smoke stays right along the ground and is technically, potentially more of a problem. And in other situations, the smoke gets wafted well up off the ground. And so these are different types of situations that the fire managers and the smoke managers need to be aware of, and they need predictions about when that's likely to happen. And the question is, can we give them those predictions at this point? I argue that there's still work to do. And then also looking at sort of larger scale, the smoke is also a multi-scale process. There's the very local situations. There's also sort of, I would say, county level, let's say. So on the order of tens or maybe even hundreds of kilometers, you can get situations where smoke rises up through the mix layer, it gets mixed through the day, and then at night or in the evening, when the heating gets turned off and the mix layer collapses, some of that smoke can come right back down to the ground. And in some cases, depending on what sort of the stability profile is over towns, you can even accentuate the smoke over a town compared to other places, which is worse. There's been all kinds of lawsuits and problems because people, particularly this happens in the southeast, where agencies intentionally lit a fire for resource management, and they smoked out of town 30, 40 miles down the road, and they were sued because there was no warning about this, and it's like, we did this intentionally, and you should have known better. And the question is, should they? Well, sometimes you can predict it, but sometimes it's still in that area where we just don't know. And then there also, the other factor with smoke is that the regional impacts of smoke. The idea is sometimes, it happens more often out in the West, but if you have 4 or 5 different agencies that are all doing prescribed burns in a single airshed, all right? If one of them was doing a burn, it wouldn't be a problem. But if you got 5 different burns that are happening along this big valley, and all that smoke comes together, it can be a problem. So systems have been developed to try to understand that, sort of the regional scale smoke dispersion and where the smoke actually goes. The blue sky smoke modeling system was developed by the Forest Service in Seattle, Washington, to try to address exactly this problem. And I'm not going to talk too much about blue sky today, but it is still another facet of the problem. So, with that sort of that's sort of the environment, if you will, or the professional environment, let's say, or the operational environment, in which I want to talk about the role of the mix layer. Okay, so here we're going to pull back and get back into the meteorological aspects. Now, there's 3 areas that I want to kind of discuss here. We'll see if I have time to get to all of them, but I think there's a decent chance. First one I want to talk about is sort of that microscale fire behavior question. What do we know and what can we know about the meteorological processes that affect how fast is that fire going to move from that tree to that tree to that tree, and what can I do about it? All right. The second question is whether sort of these what I referred to earlier as the meso-gamma scale, these hundreds of meters to perhaps up to a kilometer, when do these components of a fire really matter? What can we predict about that, and what can we pass on to the fire managers to help them anticipate when things might go wrong, or when things might get difficult for them? And then the last one I'll touch on sort of this local distribution of smoke and some of the tools we use to address that. All right. Now, the first one of those areas is sort of microscale fire behavior. Now, collecting observations around a fire is really, really difficult. I mean, it's never easy. Field projects always have inherent difficulties, and I'm not trying to suggest that it's any more or less difficult to say collecting observations around a hurricane. But one of the situations around fire is that prescribed fires, you can predict where they're going to be. We know what they're going to do, and there have been a number of efforts recently, I would say in the last 10 years or so, to put more and more instruments up around these intentional fires to try to understand what sort of airflow is happening around them. How do those airflows affect the fire? Where does the smoke go? What sort of conditions are important for whether the prescribed burn you lit acted exactly like you wanted it to? Because generally speaking, when you light a prescribed fire, you don't want it to be a major fire. You want it to be under control. You want to be able to put it out when it's done burning the area that you want. Okay? But there are questions about whether these sort of low-intensity prescribed fires have really anything to do with what's going on with these massive wildfires that are marching across the landscape, and nothing but a major rainstorm for several weeks is going to finally put them out. Okay, and it's just it's a very different sorts of energy exchanges and exchanges between the fire and the atmosphere. So there's some question as to whether investigating prescribed fires is really that useful for understanding wildfire. But setting up observation sites and flux towers and things around a wildfire, they can take days. And generally speaking, the people who are fighting the wildfire don't want you anywhere near them, because if you go to a fire site, the incident commander is responsible for your safety. It's his job to make sure that people don't die out there. So if people are out there driving trucks around and climbing towers and setting stuff up when a wildfire is bearing down on them, that's not generally the sort of thing that fire managers like to see. All right. Now, the Farsight model that I talked about earlier, and as I referred to some of the, let's say, questionable meteorological decisions that go into running some of these models, generally they don't even consider meteorological conditions above the ground. They say, fire's on the ground, let's just look at the surface conditions. They say, well, that's all well and good, but the surface conditions, as meteorologists all know, and as many people know intuitively, often have some relationship to what's going on certainly several hundred meters above the ground, and often several kilometers above the ground can affect those situations. And also, I mean, to make matters worse in some ways, oftentimes the spatial variability of surface winds, even in complex terrain, are not really accounted for. They'll say, winds from the northwest, I'll assume the winds from the northwest the rest of the day, what's going to happen to my fire? Without considering like fruit number flows and flows up and down basins and that sort of thing. And they'll use that information to try to anticipate what's going to happen with the fire. All right? So these are the sorts of challenges that we face in some ways. We're trying to say, okay, there are other ways of doing this. Let's see if we can figure out what's important and what isn't. Now, Craig Clements at San Jose State University is one of the most active scientists for setting up instruments around prescribed burns to collect meteorological observations. He sets up flux towers, and he's kind of a crazy guy. He lines up on all these things, but you also have to protect them, because sometimes you can set these up where the fire is going through. You need resistance, and we've melted a number of sonic anemometers and lost some tethysons and things over the years that make for fun stories. But we have selected some really unique and interesting observations. We had a cover story in BAMS in 2007, and sort of time series of, I mean, right here is when the fire went through, so you can see different heat fluxes and temperatures and other things that are happening at different levels above the fire when it passes these towers. And these observations have really helped us understand what's going on in some of our models. But ultimately, to get at some of the processes that are going on here, I mean, you really have to go to numerical models. It's like there are things that go on in a fire that the likelihood of us ever being able to observe them directly is pretty slim. I mean, SODARs and LIDARs and other things, you can pierce some of these things and you can get a sense of some of it. But to really delve into them, we need numerical models. So starting out in the late 1990s was when we first started trying to couple combustion models directly with atmospheric numerical weather prediction models. And warp fire is kind of an outgrowth of that. Terry Clark's model in the mid-90s was the first model that directly coupled a heat release and moisture release and sort of momentum characteristics from a fire with a high-resolution numerical weather prediction model. But since that time, there have been a number of other models that have also cropped up over the years. There's the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Dynamics Simulator that was developed in the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This model used to be for looking at structure fires. And one of those little idiosyncrasies. It was originally the idea if you wanted to get airflow into it, you had to open a window because you're inside of a house. So there's still kind of code within the WFDS. If you want to prescribe a horizontal wind for your fire, you go to the open window subroutine. You open a great big window on the side of your fire and let the wind affect the fire marching across the landscape. So that's kind of fun. But anyway, that's just one of the tools we have available. There's also the FireTech model that was developed at Los Alamos National Laboratories that kind of built up from more of the engineering side than the meteorological side. And then the University of Utah has an LES model that they've coupled with a fire model for looking at these problems. And then there's also a version of the ARPS model that some of you might be familiar with, atmospheric numerical weather prediction model that we've coupled with a fire, and we've done much of this work in-house in East Lansing as well. So all of these, we use these models to try to understand what's going on around the fire. But the challenges is that there are really deep uncertainties associated with these things. As I suggested earlier, combustion models, they're most comfortable on the centimeter scale as far as how the flames are interacting with the fluid in direct contact with it. Well, it would be a pretty brave meteorologist to suggest that we could run large-eddy simulation models down to centimeter scale on a regular basis and get anything about what's going on the landscape that's meaningful and also that's tractable with the sort of computing powers that we have. And so we have to scale these things up somehow, which means lots of assumptions and lots of uncertainty about what exactly is the right number for some of the parameters that control the combustion process and how it interacts with the atmosphere. And what this means is that both the fire spread characteristics and the meteorological conditions in some cases that come out of these models are at best suspect, and at worst, they could be completely wrong. And so I'd say there's considerable additional analysis and validation that's required before we can start to make really firm predictions from these models and use them in the forecast model. Now, with that, again, it was kind of a diversion in a sense from the mixed layer discussion, but I think it provides some valuable context. The role of the mixed layer in these processes and how the fire evolves, I would say it's embedded in management thinking. Excuse me a moment. And embedded is not necessarily a good thing, because one of the idiosyncrasies, if you will, of fire weather research over the years, and I would argue that sort of modern fire weather research, if you will, started in the 50s and through the 70s, is that there are a number of incidents, and some of these things were highlighted in a recent review paper that a colleague of mine from the Forest Service put together, Brian Potter, for the International Journal of Wildland Fire. But a lot of these issues were sort of brought up as, okay, we're fighting a fire, we saw a front go through, we saw these things change. All right, so fronts matter for fire. Okay, I can accept that. Wind shifts, you get different, all kinds of things happen around a front that can affect the fire. Which one's most important? Someone said, well, I think the winds are it. And so this whole line of research went and looked at the winds without ever going back and saying, but we said these other things were important also. And the mixed layer kind of falls into that category. There's a line of thought, if you will, that near-surface static stability is a good indicator for the type of turbulence that could happen around a fire, but also there's sort of the feeling that there's a direct impact on the sort of updrafts you get over a fire, and that these updrafts immediately feed back on the sort of fire behavior that you get. But the scientific thinking, or the scientific basis for this thinking is what I'd say it's tenuous at best. All right, but this sort of thinking sort of pervades in some ways the literature, even up to relatively recent papers, but certainly the way that fire managers think that things happen. I didn't realize those were animations. Well, you know. the way that the updraft from a fire interacts with the boundary layer. And one of the things that kind of seeps in is this idea that you have single eddies that sort of span the depth of the mixed layer. You get heating at the ground, they go up to the top of the mixed layer, and then you have sort of this return flow. And then if you have a relatively weak eddy, for instance, that's going throughout the surface up to the top of the mixed layer, and it moves over a fire, the updraft of the fire can strengthen this eddy. And then you get feedback from the fire, and the fire starts to evolve, or the fire changes its evolution. But the fact is that, generally speaking, deep mixed layer eddies they're not the only thing that's going on. Sometimes you'll get them. But I would argue that more often than not, they're relatively transient features. It's not something that every single fire is likely to interact with and is likely to feed back on them. Eddies, the mixed layer is more a combination of eddies on different scales. And so that line of thinking, again, has become fairly firmly embedded in the way that they think that a fire interacts with the mixed layer. But the question is that the case, and under what conditions does that happen? No one's ever looked into that and looked at it rigorously. Okay? So in that context, one could argue, and they also put a lot of weight behind, okay, what exactly is the mixed layer depth? What's the depth of the mixed layer? If it's 500 meters, it means one thing. If it's 1,000 meters, it means something. 2,000 meters, it means something else. I think my argument and a line of thought amongst my colleagues is that the mixed layer depth is probably not the right quantity to be looking at. Don't take the mixed layer depth and multiply it by something to try to understand what's going on with the fire. The better question might be, over what depth does the air that's feeding directly into a fire come from? Okay? Generally speaking, except for in, I would say, extremely strong wind situations, you are going to get wind that's coming down from levels aloft that's feeding into the fire zone. Okay? The question is it coming from the top of the mixed layer? Is it coming from halfway down the mixed layer? Is it coming from the lowest 500 meters, lowest 100 meters, lowest 50 meters? What's the source for this air? All right? And the models that I referred to, the couple of models that we were looking at before, have some capacity to try to answer those sorts of questions. So we're starting to do that. But again, we have to be careful about overemphasizing or suggesting that we know more than we know about what the models are telling us. Now, let's say I already referred to the stability and the effect on updrafts and mixed layers. These assertions have seldom been vigorously tested, is the point. Now, one of the efforts that we have going on right now is an outgrowth of a couple of papers that were, or a series of papers that were put together by Mike Kiefer at North Carolina State University as part of his PhD research and postdoc research that was using the ARC model, the Advanced Regional Prediction System model, to look at it in close to an LES mode, or fairly high resolution, but I don't think it was quite LES. It was more 25 to 50 meter grid spacing. But still, getting down towards LES scale, looking at the character of the convection that happens over a fire. So for these studies, Mike was asking the question, if you have a fire, what sort of control parameters determine whether you're going to get single cell or multi-cell or different types, different characters of convection happening downstream of the fire zone? Well, what we're doing now is we're going to try to turn that sort of question around and use the same sorts of simulations and the same system, but try to go down to finer scale and ask questions about what sort of stability characteristics above a fire affect inflow into the fire zone. And right now, we want to start very, very simple. We want to have a simple 2D simulation with a neutral atmosphere, and we just have an unstable layer that will start with it 1,000 meters above a prescribed fire and move it further and further down. And at what point do we start simulating simulating processes or simulating features that would suggest that inflow into the fire could change what's going on? And then once we establish that, we want to move on to the more complex 3D simulations and coupled fire atmosphere modeling, but this is kind of a first step. So in a way, we're kind of going back to basics. Like, okay, do we really understand any of this? Arguably, there's a intuitive understanding, but we want to try to be as rigorous about this as possible and build it up from the physics. So that's the first of the three areas that I wanted to touch on. Now, spend a little bit less time on these, but thinking about sort of that larger scale, sort of the mesoscale questions around fire weather forecasts. Now, National Weather Service fire weather forecasts, or produce fire weather forecasts and spot forecasts that generally look at the weather conditions over the next 24 to 48 hours and how they might affect the fire. And there are a couple of indices, or a number of indices, and it varies from forecast office to forecast office that they put out as part of this forecast. And generally speaking, the question that's being asked is, how do these conditions vary on an hourly basis? So fire managers, for instance, can know if they're going to have a wind shift between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock this afternoon. They want to be prepared for that sort of thing to happen on the fire line. And also, but the fact is that mesoscale features, for instance, the passage of fronts or sea breezes or mountain waves, or pick your favorite mesoscale phenomenon, many of these can affect changes and the variability of these features or of these meteorological processes, meteorological variables on an hourly basis. But one of the issues that we have had is that the studies that have attempted to determine the link between these sorts of mesoscale meteorological features and wildland fires are almost exclusively statistical in nature. Schrader et al., I misspelled Schrader there, so oh well. Schrader et al., back in the 60s, they did a sort of a landmark study of fires across the country and determined that fronts were a major player. When the biggest fires happened, it almost invariably involved a frontal passage of some sort. But how exactly the frontal patterns affect the evolution of a fire was really never rigorously investigated. And part of the problem with this is that getting the right fire data, knowing what might have caused the fire to get large and might not. A change in wind direction is almost certainly part of the answer for many of these situations. And this is a well-known dynamic, if you will, or at least a well-discussed dynamic within the fire field. The difference between a head fire and a flank fire. The head fire is the part of the fire that's moving with the wind. So if you have a fire here and the wind is blowing that way, the head fire is the most rapidly advancing part of the fire, and the flank fires that are sort of perpendicular to the winds, they advance relatively slowly. But if you get a wind shift, so a fire, say, spreads across the room in this direction, and the wind shift and starts spreading the fire that way, in some situations you could have kilometer-long head fires that start to propagate very, very rapidly. And this is a particular problem. I mean, it happens in many places, but in Australia with some of the really, really big damaging wildfires that have happened, there have been situations where 40-mile-per-hour winds coming from the north will spread a fire through extremely dry and arid fuels. And then you'll get a sudden wind shift with a dry front that goes through, and then you'll have 30-mile-per-hour winds that are blowing the fire directly up a hill. And this has led to some of the biggest fire disasters, particularly in parts of Australia. But the situation here is that the head fire the flank fire is turning into a head fire. It's becoming an extremely dangerous and fast-moving fire front that's difficult to get out of the way of. But there are many other things that accompany the passage of a front. Both changes in wind speed, in shear characteristics, in moisture characteristics, all of these that happen on the mesoscale. And arguably, I would certainly argue that all of these features have the potential to sort of modify either the strength or the shape or the character of the sorts of interactions that were in a schematic put together by Brian Potter in this review paper that I referred to earlier for sort of these descending rear inflow features and the sorts of interactions on sort of this mesoscale that are hypothesized to be important for understanding what's happening with the fire. And the question is, do we understand how a change in shear or change in helicity, for instance, or other sorts of numbers that could accompany a frontal passage or a sea breeze passage or a mountain wave or a rotor or these sorts of things or a thermal trough? All of these things affect changes in these conditions on an hourly basis. So the question is, have we established the role of these in fire spread and in determining size and severity? I would argue that we haven't done that, I would argue that we haven't done that in a rigorous way. All right. Now, another element of this, to sort of get back to the mixing height theme, is that the fire weather forecast often includes a prediction or a forecast of what the mixing height is going to be through the day. Now, generally speaking, this number is used for smoke applications, and if I have a minute or two, I'll talk about that shortly. But there have been a series of studies over the last 5 to 10 years or so that have been hypothesizing that mixed layer processes can contribute to sudden increases in wind speed and decreases in relative humidity at the ground that affect the evolution of a fire. And these studies have suggested that an assessment of the mixed layer depth and specifically the entrainment of conditions above the mixed layer into the mixed layer and potentially mixing those down to the ground are the relevant quantities and processes to be looking at. And we have to be careful about what scale we're talking about here also, temporal and spatial scales, but we're thinking more sort of diurnal variations in these quantities. And so a question is, not necessarily the question, but a question is that can observations or forecasts of the mixed layer depth and the conditions just above a growing mixed layer be used to anticipate sort of worst case scenarios? You got a mixed layer that's 500 meters at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the conditions suggest that you have extremely dry, anomalously dry air just above that mixed layer. Does that mean that you're going to get anomalously dry air in the next 2 or 3 hours just in the early afternoon when fires might start to act a little bit crazier, for instance? Same with high momentum aloft, low-level jets, and even just sort of free atmosphere airflow above momentum above the fire. Can that be mixed down to the ground? These studies are suggesting that it's possible, but we don't necessarily understand when that's going to be an issue and when it's not. And another complication is that here's the part where we're asking questions of the forecast models that are sort of deep in the uncertain parts of how the boundary layer schemes within the models actually work, the atmospheric boundary layer schemes. And TBL entrainment in particular is one of those areas. It's handled differently by different TBL schemes. The two schemes that I would argue are used most often within the WRF model. So the YSU scheme is in the operational version of the WRF. The Melior-Marianic scheme is often used in research applications. Both of them have very different ideas or very different formulations for how they deal with this transition between the mixed layer and what goes on aloft. And arguably, they also have different ways of sort of non-local mixing, vertical mixing within the mixed layer also that affects the character of the mixed layer. But the YSU scheme explicitly accounts for this entrainment. So does the manner in which it accounts for that entrainment affect whether dry air up here is going to make it down to the ground? And does the manner in which the YSU scheme doesn't? Is that going to make a difference as well? These are things that need to be explored and need to be understood better before we can start saying that things like these model forecasts can be useful for addressing these sorts of issues. All right. Now I'm going to skip through this a little bit, but there's also an effort that I've been working on with Dan Kaiser at the University at Albany to try to understand how different mixed layer depth formulations or diagnostics, numbers that you can use to sort of figure out what the mixed layer depth is that's coming out of a model or out of an atmospheric sounding, how those different diagnostics can affect quantities that are used for fire and smoke. And one of the points that we're looking at is the decape calculation, most commonly used, or certainly developed and used for assessing when intense convection can occur and when you can get downdrafts in convective thunderstorms and those sorts of things. But there's a suggestion within the fire community that this number could have some value for understanding how a fire might evolve. But what we're finding is that the calculation of decape within the mixed layer is extremely sensitive to really quite modest differences in how you diagnose the mixed layer. So differences in the mixed layer on the order of 100 meters in a 2,000 meter deep mixed layer can lead to differences in decape that are on the order of 15 to 20 or 25%. And so does that matter? Again, it's an area of open consideration, and we're not necessarily certain about this. All right. Now, now let's move to the smoke issue, and I'm going to step through this fairly quickly. But the factors that affect the manner in which smoke is distributed vertically above a fire are also highly dependent upon the mixed layer. Fire characteristics have some impact on this. If you have a massive fire that's releasing a lot of smoke, generally speaking, it's going to poke through the mixed layer fairly readily. But if you have a fire where you allow the mixed layer to sort of take over the dispersion and the mixing of the smoke, then you have to start asking questions about what is the mixed layer height, how rigorous is the mixing, how well distributed is the turbulence in the vertical. In some sense, how well mixed is the mixing is a question that one might ask. And the Weather Service, I referred to earlier that they include a mixing height as part of their fire weather forecast. Now the definition they use for this is the mixing height is the height at the ground to which smoke will rise. So there's sort of a smoke component to their thinking about this. But the question is, do they or can we yet, and I'm not trying to suggest that the Weather Service isn't doing a good job, I think they're doing a very good job with this, but I think there are open questions about whether just looking at a diagnosed mixed layer tells you the difference between whether the smoke is going to hang along the ground in a fire and whether the smoke is going to be lofted higher in the fire. You can get very different distributions of smoke within a mixed layer, again, depending on what type of fire you have and also what type of vertical mixing profiles you have within the mixed layer. So the question is it going to fill the mixed layer or is it going to hang around near the ground? So again, not necessarily, but the mixed layer alone doesn't necessarily tell the whole story about whether the smoke is distributed through the mixed layer. Now there are a number of, and also as I referred to earlier, the often deeper mixed layer over cities and towns can sort of accentuate this problem. Now there are a number of models and tools that have been developed. There's a huge number of smoke management tools that are out there, ranging from the very simple sort of take this number, do I have smoke, to complex multi-scale interactions, LES models with particle dispersion models in them that you can apply to this problem. And but the question is, do any of these models actually tell us useful information for smoke management? And that's sort of an open area. And again, another component of the project that Dan Kaiser and I have been working on are to look at the sensitivity of some of these quantities that they use, such as the ventilation index. And you also see real sensitivities to some of these smoke indices to the diagnosed mixed layer depth. But there's also open questions about whether this quantity is the right one to be talking about. So let me step through the conclusions here. I got a few points that I wanted to raise. The overarching point here is that the manner in which the mixed layer depth is used in fire and smoke is complex. It's in many cases poorly understood, and even by the practitioners, they think they understand things that I would argue are pretty questionable. And it's pretty clear that no one number is going to serve everyone's needs for all of this. There are a number of hypotheses that have been put forth in the literature suggesting that the traditional understanding of the mixed layer depth can help assess certain things, but other things we need some more information about it. And as I suggested earlier, we are asking questions of the forecast models that are arguably getting down into the sausage factory that is that are these mesoscale models in some ways, and these forecast models. And there are a number of observational studies that are attempting to better understand how you assess these quantities within the mixed layer and in the atmospheric boundary layer. Siebert et al. Has a series of papers that they've been doing field studies in Europe for asking some of these questions. There's also research underway at the Desert Research Institute. Matt Kieron and Tim Brown are specifically looking at these sorts of quantities and these sorts of things for smoke applications. So we're working on it, but there is definitely still work to be done. But my point, I guess the takeaway message from this question about mixed layer is that I think that there's a real need to establish sort of different types of mixed layers or different sorts of layers that one considers for what affects the fire and what affects the smoke. Different sorts of fine points about sort of the mixing height for the effective fire inflow. I think it's a quantity that it doesn't appear in the literature. It's something that's sort of a new idea, if you will, or a newly expressed idea amongst my colleagues and myself about what we really want to look at for trying to understand how the atmosphere affects the fire and how the fire feeds back on the atmosphere. And so in order to sort of fully address these questions, we need to develop and validate the coupled models, collect the right kinds of observations where we can, consider the right theories or new types of theories or new elements of theories to try to explore this. And my personal comment is that I feel this is a pretty wide open area of research. There's lots of advances to be made. Now the smoke issues are, again, confusing, convoluted. There's all kinds of different models out there, as I suggested, models ranging from the simple to the complex. Most of them rely ultimately on accurate meteorological input. I would argue that some of them are sort of hampered by the manner in which they input meteorology, and that's where we get back to some of those just considering conditions at the ground or how they use the meteorology to make predictions. And also that the microscale processes are often central players means that producing this meteorological information is complex. Okay? Add to this pressures about prescribed burn programs over Clean Air Act, PM 2.5, particulate matter, 2.5 micron particulate matter, and how much is building up. EPA and all kinds of other people are starting to scrutinize prescribed burners and fire and smoke programs and fire and fuel management programs for whether we're contributing to that in a way that we shouldn't, or they are contributing it. And the regional haze and air stagnation is also an issue. Their prescribed burn programs are being shut down because of air stagnation advisories and those sorts of things. So there are plenty of tools out there, and I'm not trying to suggest that the tools are useless. People do use the tools, but I think that there's plenty of room for improvement and considerably more information that can be applied to these problems. And also, in thinking back on this, I realized I said a lot of very negative things, I feel. I don't feel like this is all bad news for the field and the sort of stuff that we're looking at. I feel that this is actually a very exciting time. It's never been easier to use reanalysis, or more straightforward, if you will, to use reanalysis data sets to really establish connections, even if statistical connections that weren't able to do before, between fire occurrence and fire history resources that we never had before. When I first started in 2000 and I started asking about fire histories, they said, okay, you got to come dig them out of a filing cabinet and digitize them yourself. It's like 15 years later or 13 years later, things are getting a lot better and people have gone back and digitized some of those things. But even in the early 2000s, finding digital databases for some of these things was an exercise in pain, and it wasn't necessarily fun. It wasn't necessarily easy, wasn't a tractable problem. Now, the caveat I would add about these reanalysis databases is we need to have good surface conditions in them. And some of these reanalysis data sets don't necessarily have well-defined or well-represented surface conditions because of decisions that were made about how the analyses were put together. And I would also, I guess, emphasize that there are new and I would say perhaps renewed focus on testing and rigorous analysis for developing fire weather and tools amongst my colleagues, and the community is starting to realize that that's what they need to really give themselves improvement. Here we're talking about sort of the high-resolution meteorological and coupled fire atmosphere models are coming of age. I said some nasty things about them as far as whether they're believable, but at the same time, they're telling us things that we didn't know before, and they're improving on technology. The currently used technology is pencil and paper technology from the 50s, is the sort of thing that they're using for predicting fire behavior now. We have complex physics-based interactions that we're analyzing and trying to understand. And my final point is that there are new statistical tools. Some people in this room are doing some of these very things, and we're working with them, but I say across the field, applying new statistical tools to establish and quantify the relationships between weather and fire. And also particularly, I think there's a lot of potential for the ensemble weather prediction methods, but both assimilation methods and assessments of uncertainty, biases, and highlighting regimes where we have higher confidence in some of these quantities are definitely going to be needed in understanding what's important and what isn't. So I'll close on that point. Thank you very much. don't use what?
Use airplanes.
Airplanes? Oh, they definitely do. And actually, one of the, Craig Clements is I think he was talking about buying a last generation plane that was given up by other field projects and using that around some of the fires. But it's often difficult to get permission to fly around the big fires just because of safety issues. But one of the areas that is very active recently is the use of robots, basically drones, around fires. And some of them are helicopter types where they can go and hover over a fire plume and you can get information from within the smoke plume you couldn't get before. And some of them you can program in a pattern to almost model airplane level, and then also to the larger ones to fly in and out and up and down and sample them in other situations. Now, part of the problem with this is that oftentimes within fires, even if you try to keep the planes or the instruments at a level where you don't think the temperatures are really high, fires can sometimes produce protective cores where suddenly you're melting these things. And that's another situation where if you're going to crash a plane into a fire line when they're trying to fight a wildfire, incident commanders are a little bit worried about that sort of thing. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, satellite information is becoming more and more valuable and more often used. The GOES satellites, analyzing the GOES data because of geostationary, you have constant coverage, if you will, are useful for looking particularly at the bigger fires. The pixels it's hard to get down to the fine scale stuff. But the MODIS satellite, they go over twice a day. Those could be used for looking at some of the finer scale patterns. But the other aircraft with infrared cameras flying high over the fires can also give you really detailed fire spread information as well. So, and there is active research in developing those, and that's been going on for about 10 years, I would say. But it's pretty expensive, and it's not something we can do at every one. But for the big field programs, definitely we do use some of the aircraft observations as well. So we're working on it. But when you're getting down again to some of these sort of microscale, fine scale processes, it's tough to get the right scale, temporal and spatial. Yes, sir.
Kind of like a scale analysis question. Looking at, especially out west where a lot of needles and fertilizing trees, how does something like entrainment for the dry earth stack up against really dry consider?
Oh, yeah, that's it probably doesn't. I would argue that the atmospheric effects when you have tinder fuels are unlikely. Those could burn in a rainstorm if they're that dry. And one of another element of the fire science community, if you will, is that within the Forest Service and within the land management agencies, and I would even argue within the university community, the number of fire researchers who focus on fuels and how the fuels are conditioned by atmospheric conditions, but also by other physiological conditions and by dieback and that sort of thing, it's probably like 8 or 9 to 1 the size of the fire weather community. And so there is a lot of research that goes into trying to understand what the fuel conditions are, how they're varying, and then what sort of fire can those fuels support. And so that sort of question is explored by a lot of other people, and it's valuable, there's no question. But there's been comparatively less attention to what can make those conditions change on a minute by minute or an hour by hour basis. And I think there is still room. Even in the tinder fuels, if you get situations where you have where you promote a stronger updraft, or you get these sorts of mesoscale structures forming over a fire, I think that can still change the character of the fire and the sorts of problems that the fire managers might face. But for our way of thinking, we often consider the fuels as the boundary conditions. That's stuff that happens. We take input from the fires and from the fuels, and we can vary those boundary conditions. Of course, for the massive fires that are releasing huge amounts of energy, we put more energy in and see what happens. And so we do consider that, but we try not to get involved in the area that is really not our expertise as far as trying to understand exactly what's going on with the fuels. And we collaborate with other people to try to understand that better as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two curious questions. One is for the fire tornado is very rare. The fire tornado?
Yeah. Oh no, I know what you're saying. I'm not convinced it's very rare, but.
Well, that's curious. How are you going to deal with that very rare situation model? Or, well, second one will be very related. how the fire can incorporate in the weather model or the model because we don't have fire.
Well, the WRF model, there is a WRF fire module that anyone can download and couple with the WRF. So anyone can download it and play with it. Getting it to do anything useful, I mean, like anyone that doesn't know, if you don't know a model, getting it to do something useful is complicated. But it is out there. It's a standard part of the WRF package now. Is the WRF fire module. And yeah, and really the complex ones are the ones who couple the WRF fire with the WRF and then WRF chem as well. So they account for the chemistry that comes out, the chemical constituents that come out of the fire, and let WRF chem resolve those, and then get smoke information, and then spread that across the landscape. So there's sort of this nest down to the fire for propagating the fire, and then nest up to where the smoke is going to go, and account for the chemistry all along the way. And yeah, the model crashes 90% of the time. Like WRF chem crashes 80% of the time already, and then you add this to it, it gets crazy. But there are efforts to do that. Now, as far as the fire tornado issue, I mean, you have to be a little bit careful about is there a continuum of scales? Because I would argue that the sort of thing that I was looking at there, it's a fire whirl, it's more like an over-glorified dust devil or a souped-up dust devil, because it just had a lot of energy added to it, so it stretched it out. But when do those things actually scale up so they act more like a tornado? Sometimes, I mean, the one that smoked out the cars in the middle of the dry riverbed, yeah, that was a lot of energy in that one, and that one lasted a long time. But was it really acting more like a dust devil or a tornado? I think that's an open question. And there are scaling parameters that people have looked at for sort of background vorticity and those sorts of things. We're trying to say when fire whirls are more or less likely to occur. But depending on what scale you're looking at, I mean, I would argue that any turbulent eddy, if you stretch it, if it's oriented the right way, you can get a whirl. And so, it's arguably, I think it's always possible to get a fire whirl. I've been on a fire that was the size of this. I went out and saw a prescribed fire that was the size of this room. And the guys that were lighting the fire, I mean, they walk around the edge. It was just grass. There was no trees. They were walking around the edge, and they decided they were going to have some fun with it. So at the end, they said, okay, they ran and they closed it off, so that it started going like that, and the thing went whoosh. And this great big whirl went up right in the middle of it, this tiny little fire, and it moved off that way. It wasn't a tornado, but it was something.
One more question, Dalton, then we're going to have lunch here.
Okay.
So the EPA has models which calculate the rise of the heat plume and then the dispersal of smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And so are they of use to the fire?
Yes, they are. And I believe, I mean, the blue sky system that I referred to there for looking at the regional impacts of the smoke that was developed in the Seattle, Washington lab with the Forest Service. They have a number of different plume rise models that they've tested and incorporated into that system. And I think that they're closely related to the types of models that the EPA has developed. And they've collaborated with the EPA for developing some of those models over the years. So yes, they're definitely applicable. I think that they're more for the regional scale applications than the local applications. That's my understanding. But I'm not an active researcher in that area. I talk to them from time to time and understand elements of it. But I couldn't tell you the details about what specific plume rise models they use. But I do know that there have been collaborations with EPA over the years in the development of that system.
EPA has a wide range of models, the point source, the radius.
Right. Yep.
Okay, I know there's some other questions. Let's bring them to lunch. We can have a conversation there. But let's play one more time.
Okay.
So the next today is in Vancouver room.
Oh, okay, so we're making a left instead of a right. So yeah, so Vancouver is down on. I don't know.